We are stories. We're born into stories.
I just want to say happy birthday. It so happens today is Pete's birthday. And what a wonderful time to spend with him hearing about the 62 years of his life that have led him to this point.
And we're born from stories. We're born into a world, a sea, an ocean of stories.
Are you talking about the past when you had faith, or do you still have faith?
With our relatives, I can't remember that. And like, these things don't stand out in my memory.
I'd love to meet your mother. When I read that she passed at, is it recently, last year?
Yeah, last year.
At 92 years.
Faith in Our Struggle, a memoir of hope. The title of a book that is not yet in bookshops, but will be next month, written by Peter Sadie. He is my dialogue partner today, but even though Pete has been a strong supporter of my work with whistleblowers and encouraging whistleblowing, well, I'm framing this not as an elite dialogue on whistleblowing. Rather, I'm framing it on a series that I started when COVID started, which I called Tough Minds, Tender Hearts, and Steady Hand. And it was to distill wisdom within the COVID pandemic. Pete had wrote the book because of COVID. It gave him the opportunity to do some reflection. So in that sense, it is wisdom from within the COVID pandemic. But more so because at the end of each chapter, what he does with this book is have some questions for reflection. And in this one, it's a reflection on the chapter entitled Integrating Life, Restoring Hope. He's titled these reflections on carrying one's cross. He quotes from Matthew's Gospel, "Behold, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. So be as wise as serpents, yet as gentle as doves." Now, for those of you who have remembered the introductory video on the Tough Minds, Tender Hearts, Steady Hands videos, I started with that exact same scripture. I don't know if Pete knew that, but then he asked this question: how have you managed to integrate these different spirits? Has holding them in tension ever proved valuable for your life decisions? Is it possible to benefit from both qualities simultaneously? Now, Pete's a teacher, and I bet he would give me full marks for the answer I give to this one, because I can remember reading a sermon of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when we were still students together. Now, that was more than 40 years ago, and was based again on that text. And it's titled, the sermon, Of Tough Minds and Tender Hearts. The wisdom of serpents is about toughening up your minds, and the gentleness of doves is about the tenderizing of your heart. And that's always been an aspiration for me. But Pete's memoir is a concrete embodiment of how to avoid the traps of going the wrong way, being tender-minded and tough-hearted. So I thought this was a brilliant synchronicity, and this is why this dialogue is another installment to reopen that particular series. At my Christian Men's Breakfast group this morning, one of the guys was telling us about a book he had just finished, What is Amazing About Grace. I chipped in to say that your story was another amazing incarnation of grace. How does that rest with you?
Well, as a little boy, walking to school, I had a strong sense that I wasn't alone. If I hadn't done homework and I knew I was going to get some cuts from the teacher, or if I had a sports game after school, I knew I could talk to somebody to help me through all these difficulties I was going to face in life. And I've never lost that sense of God next to me. And what that means for me is it gives me courage in the face of difficult circumstances I've been through, which I write about in the book, in different contexts, different chapters of my life. But it does give me a hope amidst difficulties that you're not alone, and that you will find a way through this difficulty. And I think for me, that's a lot of what grace means for me.
You start out with that passage from Scripture from the prophet Micah, where you say, "O human being, this is what God requires of you, that you act justly, that you love tenderly, that you walk humbly with your God." Now, the interesting thing is, When my mother died in 2007, we chose exactly that same text as one of the readings because it was the legacy that my mother had left. It all starts with our parents. So especially your amazing mother, who I was really privileged to know, Teresa, say a bit more about how she embodied those and what you inherited from her.
Yeah, so first I would have to go back one step to my grandmother, because my granny was the one who had a very, very deep faith. Leaving Lebanon at the age of 15, coming to South Africa, not knowing much about, she couldn't speak English at all. She spoke Arabic, and having to give birth to 10 babies, 10 children, with the help of all the other immigrant communities who were in the city centre of Newtown in the middle of Johannesburg. A very, very strong faith, you know, went to church daily, despite the fact that she had 10 kids to look after. And then kind of passed that on to my mom. And my mom certainly got us all, you know, as you said earlier, on our knees saying the rosary, especially during month of May, Mary's month. And as a little boy, it kind of became almost like part of what we did. It didn't have as much meaning for me, to be honest, because I found my knees got sore basically. So I found that like it wasn't so pleasant, but there was a certain discipline which came with that faith. And then I know, like during mission month, at the end of Lent, we would always have fasting was taken seriously. And for me, the faith was something which you make sacrifices for from a young age. And then there was definitely a sense of peace amidst making those sacrifices, that you knew somewhere, somehow, you were getting closer to God in giving up certain things and taking on something else in the process. And so if I think about my mom, I mean, my mom and dad both had low levels of education and had very basic jobs. My mom was a secretary, my dad was a bank messenger. But they
Bank messenger, not manager.
Messenger. It was at a very low level. And in an interesting way, they were able to get all of us through a good education. And that was fundamental to my mom. And for her, a good education wasn't high marks. A good education was one where you learned what was right and wrong, what was moral, what was immoral, and that you persevered with those values throughout your life. Oh, by the way, my mom was also a very good negotiator. She would go to the principals of the Catholic schools and she would say to them, now listen, Catholic education is very important for my children. And they would say, yes, Mrs. Sadie, we know that. And then she would say, but I haven't got money to pay your fees. So she was a very good negotiator. She could get discounts, which helped us to all get a good education. And I must say, a lot of us, 4 of us became teachers and went back into Catholic schools and taught. Yeah, the faith was something very real for all of us. It was something where we walked to church on a Sunday morning. We always felt somehow lighter coming home from church because we did this together as a family, and there was a sense of belonging and closeness that all of us felt. So the church was very much the center of the community. It's where we all met, and the service was an hour, but we all stayed on the pavement outside for another hour, just enjoying each other's company and talking before we went home. So it was a place where we came together, and I think for lots of immigrant communities, it still plays a very important role. I see in my own parish now, I have a lot of people who from Zimbabwe who all meet together after church, and others who come from the Congo, and others who come from other parts of Africa, and all of the people meet after church, and there's a sense of belonging and security in a new land where they're not always seen in a welcoming way.
I mean, you and I are really, in a sense, you can relate to each other because we're from similar tribes.
Yeah.
You know, we're both from large Catholic families. I'm one of 7, you one of 9, so you beat us on that score. We were at university together, active in CathSoc and in student politics and all that. But throughout the upheavals of what was happening in the country, you know, I've walked a bit of a journey there. But what's really impressed me is that even though we are of the same tribe, truth is greater than tribe. And I'm here referring to a bias that Brian McLaren talks about, how so often, tribe is more important than truth, and our own narrative of our own identity and our belonging and our particular ethnic or racial or other thing. Your family has spread out amazingly and shows rich diversity. Yeah. What was it about your mother and father that instilled that in you?
My mother was active in the Christian Institute with Beyers Nordia, often just, making tea for everybody who had come to the church services at Wilgespreit on the West Rand. But we as kids all went along. And so a lot of the children I met over there and a lot of the kids were from Soweto, and it was like a very unusual thing for white and black kids to get to know each other at that time. Black workers came into town and you saw black adults, but you very seldom mixed with black kids, excepting for like one or two kids who might have lived, with their mothers who were domestic workers in town. But generally speaking, the past laws were there, and it was difficult for little kids to mix. But what we learned at a young age is that we were all the same. That there were good people, good kids to play with, selfish kids to play with, but the race wasn't the key factor. There were nice kids who came from different backgrounds, and we got on well with each other. And then growing up in white South Africa, we knew that there was a very strong derogatory term and derogatory way of treating black people, which we didn't kind of fit in with. And my mom would make it very clear to us that we are all God's children, and we need to treat each other with dignity and respect. And if we didn't, we were in trouble. Growing up in white South Africa, we did have some identity with the people we were living with, who we were going to school with. But we also had a sense through our faith of a broader community that we belonged to. And I mean, when I was a little boy, it was even narrower. It was people of Lebanese origin, because those were the predominant group I lived in Mayfair with, and who went to the same church and who went to school with me. And so my first two sisters married Lebanese men. And that was kind of like the expected thing, the tribe. You stay within the tribe. Then my brother, who came after them, got married to an Inglesi. Inglesi means English. It was like such a liberation for me to see, gee, I don't only have to go out with Lebanese girls, there's some other girls that are possible partners. And then, like, in terms of my own children, my wife and I brought our children up very much within a non-racial environment, post-94 when they were at school, and they went to Sacred Heart, and they, the majority of their friends happened to be of other races. In fact, the one time I went to pick up my son from a party, and I noticed he was the only white boy, and I said, how come you were the only white boy there? He said, I didn't realize.
Yeah, he wasn't even conscious.
He wasn't conscious at all of the race, actually. It's wonderful now that we have, I have a Sotho son-in-law and a Zulu daughter-in-law, and our family. There's a strong sense of belonging and a sense of what we were struggling for, which is a non-racial society where the character people have is a lot more important than the external things we focus so much under apartheid.
Yeah. Just get into the book, because that is all elaborated in that, and we don't want to tell people too much of what's in the book, because then they won't want to buy it. But I have to say, when I got this copy that you gave me the other day and I got home, the next day I said to Sharon, well, I finished the book. She says, you finished it already? So I said, yeah, no, I have. I said, because obviously, since you and I have known each other for 40 years,
you knew a lot of
there are a lot of people, like in each page, each chapter, there was somebody that popped up that I'd known. I confess I was a bit nervous, wondering that you had also dated some of the girls that I'd dated at varsity, and that they would pop up too. Fortunately, that didn't happen. There aren't any. But what struck me is that whole idea of this incredible emergence of a new consciousness of what it means to be human and have faith in the midst of the reality of oppression and injustice. Now, tell us, what was the catalyst that got you thinking?
Yeah, first conference I went to was just after my 18th birthday, an NCFS conference.
And that being the National Catholic Federation of Students
conference. So it was from people from all over the country. And I remember something I did at that conference which got me into hot water. Which was, there were a few black students from CASA, the Catholic Association of South Africa, which was separate from the white Catholic student body at the time. What I was sensing from Albert Nolan, who was our chaplain, was how important it was for us to take sides. And so what I did in the Mass, where we were all together, we created a little bit of a drama in the middle of the Mass, where two white Afrikaans looking guys came in as security policemen and arrested two of the black students who said they were troublemakers. And then as they pulled them out, people were like thrown into disarray, because what should we do? Should we try to stop them from being arrested, or should what you do to the least of my brothers you do to me? And then we made this kind of intervention in the Mass with a guerrilla theatre, really. And then afterwards, did I get into trouble from the conference leaders. How dare I interrupt the beauty of the Mass? And I never forgot how all we were trying to do was make the Mass come alive for the students. And the students were all in debate after that about, should we have let these guys be arrested, or should we have stopped and protected them? And it had a major impact on the conference in terms of some of the questions. But your original question, Albert Nolan was the chaplain to the students, and he was making it very clear to us. I mean, if you think about it, we were white students at a university who were studying to become the future professionals of the country. We were on our white horses riding into the future, and we were thrown off those horses like Paul. and we hit the ground, and we realized, actually, there's something much more serious happening here that we need to take sides on. And the chaplains around us at the time, Mkachwa, Smangaliso Mkachwa, lots of prominent leaders. Chris Langeveld was a very powerful influence on me, because I did my research on his parish in Piri, and his big thrust was to build small Christian communities. And a lot of those small Christian communities would meet and do the gospel readings before the Sunday Mass. And when the kind of street committees grew, they grew a lot out of those Bible sharing cells that had begun in those parishes across Soweto. So for me, the kind of influence of leaders like Albert, Chris, Mangaliso was to actually get us to see that God was leading us in a different direction to the one that we thought we were on prior to coming to university.
Now, that was the same experience I had. In fact, I was the conference organizer, fortunately not for the conference you started all your trouble at 2 years earlier, 1977. Also experienced the incredible influence of Albert Nolan and our friends who remain friends today, Mike D, Mike Roussos, and in which the Soweto riots had happened in 1976, which was at my first year of university. Suddenly you realize that the whole thing is, what did conversion really mean? And we had also Archbishop Dennis Hurley, which pops up a lot in your book. He was my Archbishop in Durban. And that was when I had to also start making up my mind. You went a little bit further than I felt I was able to go, and that you then, at university, you joined the ANC Underground, MK. Now tell us that, because that really, I think, is the one chapter in this book which people are going to be really interested, because there's something unknown about that era.
The struggle was really non-racial, in the sense that many of the people I met were from different racial backgrounds. And I think to some extent we've lost that tradition. And that's a concern for me, because if we're going to have a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa, it's got to be embodied by the people who are participating in different ways in our society. And of course, our struggle was always an African-led struggle. There's no question about that. But the point is there were people from other minority groups who were part of things. At the time I was at university, there were only 10% black students at Wits, for example. It was just at the beginning, the early 80s, where black students were beginning to come onto campus. The interesting thing is a lot of the black students who needed accommodation, and there was no accommodation for black students close to the university, so the church became one of the places where they could find accommodation. And for example, Trinity House, which is right next to Wits University, was a place where lots of black and white students shared the accommodation.
Now, from what I'm hearing you say, Peter, is that your mother, the nuns, the church, the schools you went to, the Catholic schools, were repositories for where you developed two complementary things: conscience and consciousness. An ability to be aware of what's happening in the world, and also being aware of what it means to be true to yourself and to your own ethical convictions. We had the benefit of having Albert Nolan's extraordinary ministry when his book was published, Jesus Before Christianity, which is still in print today and has been published in how many languages. And we were very privileged, when you think about it, to have had the benefit of this liberation theologian who is in the midst of a cauldron of injustice, of apartheid, and to have to try and grapple with the imperatives of what that meant for our own lives and vocations. How was that influence on you and leading you to the point where you joined the ANC underground?
Well, you see, the commitment to fighting apartheid was simple. I mean, we realized at an early stage that that was something we had to do. For me, it happened at a young age, because my scoutmaster was a security policeman, and he told us that Beyers Naudé was a terrorist. And I knew Beyers. And Oom Bey was a good man to me. He always was interested in us as kids. And he was standing outside a church where Beyers was going to preach. And he said, and he was taking photographs of everybody who went in. And he said, "Don't go in here. This is a bad man." And I said, "No, you're wrong." And that was when I was at school at about 15.
Yeah.
And then what happened subsequently when I went to university, it was clear for me that we had to, in CATSOC, we had to side with the students who were protesting against apartheid. And that was already conflictual, because we had a lot of conservative white Catholics who didn't feel that we should be mixing politics and religion. But I think from Albert and Chris and other theologians' perspectives, they had helped us to see that justice was something integral to our faith. But now the shift to join the ANC was a big jump, because the ANC was a banned organization. If you were a member, you would either be imprisoned or killed. And that was a big step to take. But when we reflected very carefully on all the protest action, all the organizing we were doing, we had a clear sense that this was not going to get rid of apartheid on its own. That there had to be some coordinating body who would be in a position to link up all these different small groups who were fighting against apartheid. And at that time, the ANC was the leading body which was leading the struggle. There was a bigger movement in exile of lots of people who had, young people who had left the country in 76, who were now in camps all over. And there was also an international anti-apartheid movement which was growing in different Western capitals. But we knew that without strong resistance within the country, that would never work. And we had to actually get people coordinated in a way which would enable the struggle to go forward. So the step to join the ANC made sense to me, because I remember at one point I said to my one friend, "I'm sure the ANC is not very active here at Wits University." And he said, "Why do you say that?" And I said, "I say that because they should have recruited us long ago if they were here." But the next week I did get recruited. And then the next major thing that we did when we joined the underground was to publicize and make the ANC's message get across, that it was alive, that it was working to oppose apartheid, and that people should be actually coordinating their struggles with the ANC. And what happened is the mass democratic movement was developing a momentum of its own, and the ANC in exile was actually in a way losing step with the events within the country, which were going a lot faster. And there was a need to link up the underground inside the country with the mass democratic movement, and then coordinated by the ANC that was mostly in exile at that point. And the underground was pretty weak, relatively speaking, if you think about it at the time. But then as we began, and the struggle during the 1980s with states of emergency began to get more and more, the conflict got escalated to a point where there were lots of deaths. It was a real war going on. In KZN especially, where the IFP and ANC were really battling over certain areas. And then it got to a point where just getting the message of the ANC out wasn't enough. There was a third force which had been armed and who were beginning to massacre people inside the country, and it was imperative that we were able to actually find some way of defending the lives of people. And so we began to bring arms into the country, and we were able to hide the arms, and then we were able to bring some of the leadership from exile back into the country and met with them regularly inside. And then we had to start getting arms to self-defense units from underground cells in different communities in townships around Gauteng. And that was very risky business at that time, but we knew that if people were unarmed, the massacres would be destructive, and many people would lose their lives. And when there was some resistance and return fire from MK guys who were in the country, that there would be a lot more wariness about simply going into those communities. And the one example was Alexandra, where the 6-day war ground to a halt when there was return fire from MK people on the ground in those communities.
Now, it's very interesting in revisiting that, because you talk in your book about how within Cathsoc there were
the Happy Clappies
and those who were more socially, the God Squad and I actually found myself somewhat straddling both, because I was very much more and influenced by working within other Christian societies at the university and ecumenically and all the rest. And I'd spent a year in the military already, and I'd seen firsthand. I was in a non-combatant role when that was 1975. 1976, Soweto riots happened. Albert Nolan's books published. I then, at university, was able to delay further conscription. I was influenced considerably by Martin Luther King Jr. And nonviolent commitment. And this is something which is still a hot debate today, Albert Luthuli. And a reading of history that Walter Wink, another well-known...
The
Third Way, where he talked about, and he said, in a visit, if you remember, he circulated a manuscript of his book, The Third Way, for us to read, where he actually tests this observation, that all the successful campaigns and actions that contributed to the crumbling of apartheid were non-violent. It was sports and cultural boycotts, it was economic sanctions, and white men refusing conscription. But you know what really helped me make up my mind to conscientiously object and to refuse further conscription? I was with a colleague, I also graduated by then, working as a social worker with World Vision. And one of my black colleagues, he said to me, "John, can you explain to me as a Christian," he says, "why," he said, "I'm not judging you," he said, "why is it that white Christian brothers of mine can justify going and putting on a uniform for the SADF?" He says, "Just explain to me the reason, because I don't understand it." He says, and the question's coming from someone. He says, "I was one of only 7 matric students in Soweto in 1976 that did not leave the country to go and join MK." I mean, the minute he told me that, I said, well, that's the end of military conscription for me. Well, that was the choice I had to make, and was involved in the conscription campaign and all the rest. But I was concerned that, of course, it's logical that the ANC would want, tactically, to have the enemy, the army, start having people deserting it and refusing to turn up as a necessary tactic in terms of a military strategy. And I was at that point of saying, I simply cannot find myself caught up in this violence because I don't see anything redemptive about it ultimately. Now that was my position back then.
Yeah.
I have to say, as I fast forward now and I see what's happening in Ukraine and other places, I have to ask myself, am I still that universal pacifist type? Would it now be not incumbent upon me, if I were in Ukraine today, to actually go and fight? So I'm still in this moral dilemma, and you chose another path. And what is your reflection on that vexing generative issue?
Well, the churches had the just war theory, which has very clear conditions in terms of when is a war just. And we analyzed it pretty carefully in terms of minimal violence, and I think that's something one has to remember. The ANC had the ability to actually have terror campaigns, like many other international organizations have conducted when they were resisting oppression. The ANC didn't tolerate terror. By and large, it was armed propaganda. And what do we mean by armed propaganda? It was to get the masses to a point where they were actually going to stop being governed and bring the apartheid state to its knees. Perspective that we were going to have a Cuban revolution where people were going to be sitting on the top of tanks coming into Pretoria was never a realistic perspective as far as I was concerned. It was always a case of getting the consciousness of the ordinary people of our country to the point where they would resist apartheid, and there would need to be a negotiation because of the economy being brought to its knees, because of international isolation, because of the protest and resistance within the country, because the underground was able to coordinate these events in such a way that apartheid could no longer govern in the same old ways as it had before. And so for me it was never a case of a military victory which was possible. SADF was a very highly organized military machine, but even the highest organized military machine can't cope with a mass mobilization of people who are refusing to be governed in the same old way. I knew at the end there would have to be a negotiation. There would have to be a way of actually getting the two parties to horse trade and to find some way in which democracy could be brought in and allow South Africans to live in a different kind of environment.
But now, would that not have happened a lot earlier had MK not been founded, and had Albert Lutuli's vision, a non-violent struggle, not actually been more? And the trouble that we're in today, I just pose this as a question, is it because of a strategic decision taken in the 60s, which unfortunately history has shown to perhaps have had massively unpleasant unintended consequences? Now it sounds like we're back in NCFS days.
Not at all, because it's a fair question, and I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. But what I can tell you is people did get mobilized when they heard the AK-47 shooting back at IFP hostels, when IFP hostels were armed with R1 rifles and were shooting indiscriminately at unarmed people. So all I can tell you is it depends where you were sitting. If you were one of those unarmed people in a township whose families were being killed, you would be very excited about the fact that there was someone defending you. I mean, there are choices that we have to make in difficult circumstances. Marx put it nicely. People make history, but they make it under conditions which are not of their choosing. And the problem is, in hindsight, it's easier to see what we made mistakes. And part of why I wrote the book is so we can be honest about the mistakes we've made and learn from them. And certainly one of the mistakes I am concerned about is how we saw violence as a way of actually addressing problems. But I'm still sticking to the point that it wasn't the same as other terror organizations which were operated in the world. There were individuals right towards the end who did put bombs into public places where innocent people were dying, and it was seen as victims caught in the crossfire. To me personally, I fought strongly within the underground and the ANC that those things did us no justice. We needed to actually have the higher moral ground internationally and show that our movement was one which was actually ready to govern, and we weren't just crazies who were hell-bent on taking governance through violence. So I don't think the violence that we had from the people's side was ever the major threat in the country. The major violence was always coming from the state side, and it was always a question of self-defense, as far as I could see, in terms of what we were doing in response.
And your story about what happened, Alex, is pretty convincing. Yes, it's quite well documented.
The only problem for me about it is that subsequently some of the MK guys who are unemployed and desperate did use those same arms to hold up banks and to do things which were not part of what we were struggling for. And that's the problem with arms. Once they go out, you don't know how they're going to be under control later on. There was a campaign to try and bring guns back after independence and make our South Africa a safer society, but a lot of people were very fearful and therefore kept the guns. And I think we are reaping some of the rewards, bad rewards of the seeds that were sown. If it was possible to have made our struggle less violent, I think it would have been in everybody's interests.
Well, I'm just saying, what lessons can we learn in terms of conflicts today and the risk of... People have already got enough to convince him this is a book worth getting. But there's more, It's not just about, us sort of lefty, liberal, white kids at university getting all ideologically high on our own juice about becoming heroes of a struggle and that. No, this was life choices that we made, which were costly and consequential for us. But you then went on, and tell us briefly about how your career shaped up after democracy.
Well, I was a teacher at Sacred Heart, and my children were at the school, and it was very nice to be able to take them to school in the morning, bring them home, and we could be quite close. But I knew that comfortable space for me in my old school that I'd been to wasn't exactly where I needed to be as we were going into a new democracy. And one of the groups that I am still particularly concerned about is children of urban poor families, single moms who can't actually put bread on the table and whose older sons, often in their teenage years, go into crime. And with a very good intention of feeding their younger brothers and sisters. And for me, if our independence didn't make a difference to the lives of urban poor people, rural poor people, then we wouldn't have achieved what we had struggled for. And so I took up a position of principal of a detention center just on the outskirts of Krugersdorp, which was owned by Bosasa. At that time it was called Diambu, but it changed its name to Bosasa later on. And my focus in that prison environment as a principal was to try and get young men educated in a skill that would enable them to make a living when they left jail. And the priority was artisan skills, because a lot of those boys had left school long before they got anywhere near to matric, and therefore teaching them electrical work, plumbing, motor mechanics, welding, carpentry. These were things they could do, and they were confident they could do well. And so we developed courses where they would be able to do this work, and hopefully when they left jail, be able to actually channel their entrepreneurial spirit. They were very entrepreneurial, not afraid of risks, but in a legal way. Now the recidivism in terms of return offenders is very high internationally, but true also in South Africa. It's around 85%. And what I saw, which was good news for me, is that after boys had been with us 2-3 years and they returned, they were very embarrassed. Now for me that's a positive sign, because it says, and the majority didn't return. There were a number who returned, but they felt a sense of shame.
The ones that didn't return hopefully went on to become wonderfully upstanding members.
Well, as I say in the book, that some of them I do see when I go and do training in companies, and it's wonderful to know that they're now the fathers of a family.
That was one of the most interesting chapters in the book for me, because, and it was a wonderful story about restorative justice of correctional services working for rehabilitation of offenders. And then it was cut short by Gavin Watson basically insisting that he wanted things done a certain way, and that you left. Now, I actually have to say, I confess to feeling really angry that something that was blooming and that had so much potential was cut. And I say this because, as people know, Angelo Grizzi is a friend of mine, and I saw what good work he was trying to do as well, and we now know what a shocking story, how things took a turn for the worse. Tell us a bit about your reflections on that in the light of what you now know, looking back. You took a brave decision then too, not to just simply acquiesce to Gavin Watson's rule.
Look, the centre was in difficulty because the department, it fell under the Department of Social Welfare. There was lots of stories of boys being beaten, and they knew they had a risk of losing that contract. So Gavin was very keen for a guy like me to come in there and transform it, and he supported my initiatives in terms of getting all the kids into school, getting them to learn skills. He started to make it a kind of flagship for his company, where every visitor that he wanted to get contracts with, he would take on a tour through the venue. And it was always embarrassing for me because suddenly the boys would be in good uniform, the food they would eat that day would be better. It was like a real show. And I mean, I could see through all of that nonsense. And the big thing for me was, how are we helping these boys to actually make a different life for themselves? How are we helping them to see who they really are, not the terrible names they've been labeled with, you know, robber, thief, hijacker, murderer. All those kinds of names were not who they really were. Those were kind of write-offs of people who had human dignity, who were good people. The thing that amazed me, I got to know a lot of the boys in jail were in their teenage years, some in their early 20s, who were some of the nicest people I've met. Murderers especially. Because they were actually genuinely good people. They had made mistakes, but that one mistake they made should not be the thing that defines who they are. And the big process for me was helping them to see who they really were. So for example, one Easter, just before Easter, we got the priest, old Irish priest, to come there, and he said to the boys, I'm going to offer all of you who want to come to confession to come to confession. Well, you wouldn't believe it. The queue was around the soccer field. I've never seen such a long queue for confession in my life. And all the boys went to him one by one and told them things which were burdening them, that they had done, which they felt terrible guilt about. And he gave them absolution. And for me, it was like one of the places where I've seen the sacrament of reconciliation really honored, both by the boys and the priest. What we did as well is we had baptisms inside the jail. And the priests would come, and we had a bath which we would put into the courtyard, and all the boys would go in with their prison clothes under the water. They wanted to get submerged, and when they came out, they would put on their civvies. Really? And it was symbolically very powerful in terms of a change in direction that they were making. And so that spiritual conversion for me is at the heart, if we want to change people and help people to find a different way of doing things. It's at the heart of what we need to be doing.
Well, there's a film to be made about just that chapter, and a film of hope and inspiration. And I just hope that somebody's watching this video who kind of talk to Gavin Hood or one of the big filmmakers, because I could well imagine that being a wonderfully healing and transformational story to be told. Do you agree?
The sad part for me was the dismissal. But I could see the writing was on the wall. And Gavin was clever, and although he supported me at the beginning, he used to complain to me because I would want better things for the boys so that they would have a better chance. I would want teachers. He wouldn't give me teachers, but I would find guys who were working in the jail who had a skill, and then I would use that skill in whatever area they had a gift. And a lot of those guys were unqualified who were doing the teaching, but they loved the boys. And it's amazing when you love boys and you teach them something, how they respect you and they want to learn and they want to show you that they've actually they can master the skill that you're passing on to them. And there were a lot of those guys who were simple workers really, but they had a love for carpentry, electrical, welding, and they all kind of would share that love with the boys, and the boys would take on the passion that they had for the skill that they had.
Now that's wonderful, but it's still making me even more angry that the whole thing should have ended the way it did. Anyway, let's move on.
Yeah.
Because your book doesn't end with that.
No.
What I just loved about your courage and frankness about talking about your marriage, your divorce, and that whole very sad saga. I want people to know that there is a second chance, and
definitely.
that you did, and you exemplify somebody, person you would have least expected, I suppose, to actually have your marriage end in divorce, given everything that was about you.
Yeah, look, what was difficult for me is, as a Catholic, divorce was out of the question. And so I was the first person in my family of 9 kids who got divorced. And for me it was like an admission of failure. And I think there is that stigma for lots of Christians when their marriage breaks down. And I think the sad part is that it's often internalized, and people feel that they don't deserve a second chance. You know, what was funny for me is when I met Charmaine, my second wife, I'll go back to Wendy, the first wife, in a moment, but when I met her, I knew that God was comfortable, because I could see what positive impact we were having on each other, and our love for each other was healing us both, because Charmaine had been through a similar divorce to me. And when my priest listened to our story, and when we were querying about an annulment, he said, you've got to understand one thing, God is a little bit more relaxed than the church. And I like the way he put it, you know, because he said the church is slow to change, but I can sense that you two care for each other, and that God would bless your marriage. But I can't, as an official of our church, bless your marriage, because I'll get into trouble with the bishop. So I do think often what happens in life is that it's not like you're just changing the rules to suit yourself. Some people would see it that way. But it's that you have a sense that God would want you, and to be an example to your children that marriage works. And what's interesting for me is all of my children have got married in church with the same kind of commitment that Wendy and I had when we were young. And we made those vows in front of our community. What's sad for me is that people can change. People can move apart. People can go in different directions. And in Wendy and my case, that's what happened. I, in hindsight, wish I had got separated from Wendy sooner, because the last 10 years of our marriage were very difficult. I knew I was alone in this marriage. I knew, you know, there wasn't any closeness anymore. But I persevered for 10 years just because for me it was unthinkable that you could actually get divorced and remarry.
Well, the counsel I give to clients, and you know, who stay together, particularly obviously when they have children, because that's when social workers get involved, is I say, you know, evidence is it's better for a child to come from a broken home than to live in one.
Well, my kids said to me they were relieved when we got divorced, because they could feel this incessant undercurrent of conflict and tension in the house growing up, and suddenly when Wendy left, that was released. But just to be fair, you know, there were 5 of us in the underground in our cell, and all of the 5 got divorced. So I think one thing which you have to recognize is that the pressure of being in the underground and living a double life. I mean, for the first years of my marriage, I didn't tell Wendy I was in the underground, because that was our way of protecting people. If they didn't know, they wouldn't be able to say anything under torture.
And a marriage is supposed to be about no secrets, so you can imagine.
So it did create tension for Wendy, and she felt let down when she discovered that I was in the underground. She knew I was always going off at late hours and doing things which were unusual, but she knew she could trust me, so she didn't think I was having affairs. But later on, I think we just moved apart from each other.
Well, my whistleblower clients will identify with that too, because it's enormously stressful. Several of them have had to find difficulties in the relationships. Several of them found they're turning to alcohol and sort of drug and sort of, because it's an unnatural situation for a person to have to live in.
Yeah.
But you came through it all, and I laughed till my stomach hurt when you told the story of how you met Charmaine, and that you had been set up to go and meet with her at this particular place. And you went looking for some sweet and sour Chinese food.
Yeah, so there was a really sour-looking Chinese woman at the same venue at the same time. And when I saw her, my heart just sank. I thought, no, this will never work. But when I went to greet her, she seemed like a bit surprised that I was greeting her, and walked away. So I thought, well, I don't know. And then Charmaine came just shortly after that and greeted me with a warm hug. And I thought, thank God.
And I laughed at that. I loved your use of the metaphor of the sweet and sour. And your book's written with a lot of amusing incidents in that. What's nice about it is there is this lightness and the sense of being able to tell an honest story.
But you see, the other part of what makes it light for me is you've got to get out of your own skin and see the way God would see some of the dilemmas that you go through. And I'm convinced God's got a sense of humor. Because when you look at your own life and you see some of the strange things that you go through, in hindsight you can laugh at them.
Yeah,
at the time it's like you're in the moment and you're kind of embracing what's going on around you, but in hindsight you can often laugh.
Well, I mean, if you just say, if Jesus came to heal the brokenhearted, well, one of the most powerful healing remedies is humor.
Yeah, definitely.
Laughter.
The other important thing is that it's not my story. It's our story, and it's our story because a lot of the events that I've remembered and put into the book are ones which were passed on orally between us. So for me, as a little boy growing up with my brothers and sisters, a lot of the events that took place we recounted afterwards and became part of our mythology, if you like. And similarly within the struggle, a lot of the events we went through we spoke about afterwards. One of the things we had throughout these processes were review groups. And one of the things we did in our Christian review groups is we reflected on our experience in the light of the gospel. And that enabled us to actually see where God is leading us, even amidst difficult circumstances, and instilled in us a sense of hope. And that was something very powerful for me, especially as a young man, when I was doing all these crazy things. I had a certain sense that God was with us and God would help us to get through the mess that we were in, that we weren't alone in these struggles.
Well, I love the way at the beginning of the book you talk about Richard Rohr and his simple model of how we need to move from order to a reordering, but there's no one-stop flight from order to reorder. You've got to go through disorder.
Yeah.
And it's a book which is so honest about that disorder, but through that disorder, through all that chaos, through all that suffering, through the sacrifice that you make, you do see this lovely emergence of a reordering that is so enriching to everybody.
Look, it wasn't that for everyone. So many of the people we were with died. Some of them are friends, and I speak about a few of them who I knew well. I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm one who was able to come through all that mess and find a reordering. Not everybody does.
Well, everybody can. I think that for me is you don't have to have any extraordinary sort of, being specially favored. Everybody has a potential to be that, and it's about the choices that you made.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a key part of why I'm writing the book. Is I want another generation who's coming in behind us to have a sense that their choices do matter. One of the problems I think with the kind of growth of social media and a lot of kind of interaction via virtual experience is people lose a sense of their own power. And we give over power to others to control us through the media and all kinds of things. And I want young people to know that they must never underestimate the power that God gives them to make changes when they see things are not working, and when they're able to stand up for what they believe in and get others together with them to begin to fight against the things which are robbing us, which have hijacked our struggle, which have undermined the values that so many people were prepared to give their lives for and did give their lives for.
Well, what came to mind, and this is a good point in which to wrap things up, I've been hugely inspired by Ben Okri, and I'm going to put up now a link to a TED talk he gave some 8 years ago, talking about the power of story and how we all, every human being has a story.
We are stories. We're born into stories, and we're born from stories. I would say story is a perpetual consciousness of reality. There are two great stories that run our lives. The first is the public story that we tell about ourselves. But there's another story, more powerful, sometimes more insidious, and I believe it's that story that is actually the deep shaper of our lives. I call it our secret story. There are nations that say they're one kind of people, but actually things they do contradicts this public image that they give of themselves. This secret story, I believe, either sabotages our public story or it strengthens it. I know of nations who would love to be great and successful. I come from such a nation. And yet, at a crucial moment, we go backwards. Why is that? This secret story is a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I believe that unless we change that secret story, our public stories will never achieve the possibilities that we would most desire and most dream of. For me, the journey of life is the journey of discovering the first great story I wanted to talk to you about. And that, I believe, is the story that we came here with. I believe we came here onto this planet with another great secret story. Robert Louis Stevenson said, "The first important thing in life is to discover what it is you want to do." I think discovering what you want to do is that first great secret story. I think the ideal is when our conscious story has become so powerful that it has become our secret sabotaging story. So that we carry within us, if you like, not a virus of fear, but a virus of light. Look deeply within ourselves for these two great stories that we carry within us. The great dream, the great hope, the great promise that we brought here to this planet. And that other niggling, doubting, self-sabotaging story that prevents us realizing our true possibilities. And to find a way to harmonize them.
Well, Ben Okri, the reason I love him, he's got this quote which I keep using in all my videos where he says, "Stories are the secret reservoir of values. If we change the stories individuals and nations tell themselves, we change the individual and the nation. If they tell themselves stories that are lies, they have to live the consequences. If they tell their stories which confront and face their own truth, they will free their history for future flowerings." Now he's talking about nations. So give me your thoughts, Pete, on our national story, because right now it's not looking good.
Well, in terms of those values that we have a choice about, which are clear from the gospel, there is a choice. People have to choose sides. And what we see in our country happening at the moment is those temptations of greed and power and status are actually tainting the direction that our struggle should be going in. While some people are benefiting, the majority are actually in a worse off position. I wouldn't say then they were under apartheid. I think post-apartheid we could have been a lot further down the road in enabling people to have a better education, in enabling people to have better health services, to have water, to have electricity. But these things are all being destroyed by corruption and mismanagement. I think we mustn't underestimate that. But if we can address the weaknesses in that system by naming what is going wrong and addressing the problems, we can actually move South Africa forward in a much more positive direction. But that does take leadership, and that does take courage, because if you stand up against those people who are benefiting from the current system, just as standing up against apartheid, they will hate you and they will hunt you down. And what we need to do is, you can't do this alone. You can break my pinky quite easily with your hand, but we need to get a unity again of people who are prepared to work together to actually bring our country back in a direction which creates a future for our children and our grandchildren. And that future needs to be a much more peaceful South Africa. It needs to be one where the inequalities are addressed, and it needs to be one where nationalism doesn't enable us to actually treat people from other African countries in ways which are disrespectful, but rather in ways where we're recognizing the dignity and the value that people bring to our country when they work together with us. You know, one of the things that happened for me quite clearly at the beginning of our struggle, 94, when the Israelites left Egypt, they didn't go into the promised land. They went into the desert. And in the desert they got tempted by all kinds of things, mostly mammon, money. And that distracted and derailed them. A whole generation who had grown up in Egypt and who were attracted to the values of Egypt had to actually be, moved aside for a new generation to come up.
New consciousness to emerge.
Which would see through the false values of status, of greed, of all the other things, power over people, so that they would see what was needed to build a new kind of society based upon different values, ones of sharing, ones where the inequalities between people were closed rather than opened wider and wider, where the tribalism that you spoke of earlier is narrowed, and we begin to see the dignity in each other. The kind of ways of resolving conflict through violence are surpassed by people who learn to talk to each other and really listen to each other and find creative solutions to some of the problems we face.
The book is excellent in the final chapter where it does sum up the important issues. So it's more than just a memoir, a story. It's actually something which I can well imagine being used in catechism classes for young adults, for YCS. And I say this a little bit enviously, because when I went and saw Fr Albert Nolan, our common mentor, when I was writing my book, he says, "John, write the book so that it can be basically a prescribed text for universities and theology faculties." He says, "Then you will make money from it." Yeah, it's this priest who's taken vows of poverty and that.
It was a bestseller.
And this book, like for 25, 30, 40 years it's been in print. So I would think that you're more likely to have your book in several reruns and several different languages and translations.
My hope is that I break even.
No, seriously, I say that with a bit of envy, because I really do think you get it so right. So Pete, thank you. And so, folk, this is a very important book for anyone who identifies themselves in this following list of potential readers. People who strive to be tough-minded and tender-hearted, who want to be tough-minded in terms of the social, political, ecological analysis, but tender-hearted in showing concern for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. Not just social workers that have that obligation. That is our human responsibility to show compassion. Bonhoeffer had this lovely saying which he said, "We must not judge people for what they do or fail to do, but must judge people for what they suffer." Pete was active in the YCS movement. He talks about that. and was very attuned to the see, judge, act from the values of the gospel. And I really think that that approach is still so valid today as it has ever been. Even more so because of so much that's going wrong. Excellent praxis for those who try and make this false dichotomy between faith and works. I remember Albert telling us, it's not faith or works, it's faith that works. Secondly, people have gone through divorce or breakup of long-term relationships. The stigma and exclusion they might feel, particularly if they'd been married in the Catholic Church, and if they've been remarried. It's a story which shares the ups and downs of it and how grace has manifested in this thing to bring and to transform, to bring a newness into your lives. People who are struggling with their own stories, needing to live with a perpetual consciousness of our stories. What's really going on? And how do we find people that we can share those stories to and transcend our shame and the sense of self-judgment and that sense of beating ourselves up? He's had the courage to share his own secret story and as a role model for us to do the same, experience the same emancipation. And I'm sure there are still some secrets that you still need to be kept secret. I'm not going to probe you on that. Insensitivity to the others, and that I think you've done an excellent job of threading that delicate needle of being absolutely honest with your own story, at the same time respectful to other people and not to shame them. Finally, the other audience for this book are your grandchildren.
Certainly.
They're all too young to read it now, and I'm going to make sure I keep an eye on their development and make sure when they're ready, if you haven't given it to them, they'll make sure they get it. Finally, I just want to say, Pete's on the cover, he talks about faith in our struggle, a memoir of hope. Now, of course, if people know Paul's great teaching in Corinthians, there's faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Now, love didn't need to be on the cover because it's inside the book. There is extraordinary testimony of how love will find a way.